Hello everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into another intense and emotional chapter in the story of Jack and Tu Tien, where jealousy turns dangerous and love is put to the ultimate test. Huang's blind envy and Hai's greed lead to a cruel plan that leaves Tu Tien fighting for her life, while Jack struggles between heartbreak and hope at her bedside. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes, and please tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly means the world to us. The low hum of the bar mixed with the faint clink of glass and whispered laughter. But at the far corner, where the light barely reached, Huang sat in silence, her expression cold, her eyes hollow. The glow from the bar's neon sign flickered against her face, tracing the shape of someone who had lost control long ago. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't look. She already knew who it was, her manager, probably wondering why she hadn't shown up to work, why her mind seemed to be somewhere else these days. But how could she explain that her thoughts had been consumed entirely by one person? Jack. The man she once believed was hers. The man who smiled at her during late meetings, who offered to walk her to her car when the rain poured, who had once said, "You deserve someone better than this company." For months, she clung to those words like a promise, but now he was spending his time with Tu Tien. Gentle, quiet, unassuming Tu Tien. Huang's lips twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "Why her?" she muttered, her fingers tightening around the glass until it creaked. "What does she have that I don't?" Across from her sat Hai, a man who looked like he'd seen too much and cared too little. His hair was messy, his shirt half unbuttoned, and his smirk came too easily. He'd been listening quietly until now, sipping on his whiskey. "You want her gone?" he asked, voice low and gravelly. Huang's eyes flickered toward him. She didn't answer right away. The question lingered in the air like cigarette smoke. "I want her out of his life," she finally said. "For good." Hai leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That can be arranged." Huang frowned. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "People walk alone on those country roads all the time. One slip, one accident. Things happen." Her breath caught. "You're not serious." He tilted his head, studying her. "You want results, don't you? I don't do half measures. You said you wanted her gone. I can make it happen. You just tell me how far I go." Huang looked down at her drink. The ice had melted, the water swirling around like her thoughts. Her stomach twisted, but jealousy burned hotter than fear. "No," she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. "Not dead, just hurt. Enough so she remembers she doesn't belong near him." A slow grin spread across Hai's face. A broken leg, maybe a few bruises, something she won't forget. Huang stared at him, the words echoing in her mind. It sounded monstrous. But then again, so did the pain of watching Jack hold another woman's hand. She raised her glass and took a long drink, the liquid burning her throat. "Do it." Hai nodded, his smile fading into something darker. "Consider it done." The music from the bar thudded in the background, but Huang barely heard it. Her thoughts were already elsewhere. On Jack, on Tu Tien, on the way things used to be before everything went wrong. "Jack should have loved me," she whispered to herself. "He was supposed to." Outside, the night deepened. Rain began to fall lightly against the glass, streaking the neon lights into blurry lines. It was the kind of night that hid sins and whispered promises of revenge, The next day, the countryside road shimmered under the cruel heat of noon. Dust rose with every gust of wind, settling on the golden fields. Tu Tien walked slowly, holding a small bag filled with milk bottles for the stray dogs near her farm. The simplicity of the moment soothed her, the rhythm of her footsteps, the hum of cicadas, the distant laughter of children playing near the river. For once, things felt peaceful. After all the storms, all the chaos, she finally believed life was turning toward light again. Then came the sound. A roar, sharp, sudden, out of place. She turned, just a flash of metal, sunlight glinting off a windshield, and before she could react, the car hit her with brutal force. The world spun. The bag of milk exploded against the ground, white liquid splashing across the red dirt. Pain seared through her leg, her body crumpling to the earth. Her breath hitched, the edges of her vision darkening. "Help!" she tried to whisper, but her voice barely left her lips. A few meters away, Jiang froze. She had been on her way from the market, a basket of vegetables in her arms, when she saw it happen. Too fast to comprehend, too horrible to believe. "Tu Tien!" she screamed, dropping everything and running. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside her friend, who lay motionless on the dusty road. Tu Tien's eyes fluttered weakly, her breath shallow. "Jiang." "Don't talk," Jiang said, her voice trembling as she grabbed her phone with shaking hands. "Hold on, please. Just hold on." The distant echo of an engine fading away was the only reply. She called Jack. "Jack, you have to come. It's Tu Tien. She's been hit." Minutes later, Jack's car screeched to a halt, gravel flying beneath his tires. He didn't even close the door as he sprinted toward them. "Tu Tien!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands hovered over her body, terrified to touch, terrified to hurt her more. Her face was pale, dust streaking across her cheeks. Blood trickled down from a small cut near her temple. "Her pulse! She's breathing!" Jiang cried. Jack pressed his fingers to Tu Tien's wrist, relief flooding through him at the faint beat beneath her skin. "Thank God," he whispered, tears welling up. "She's alive." But that relief turned quickly into rage. His jaw clenched, his breath heavy. "Who did this?" Jiang could only shake her head. "I don't know. The car. It didn't stop." Jack's heart thundered in his chest. He lifted Tu Tien gently, cradling her as if she were made of glass. "Hang in there," he whispered. "Please, just stay with me." The wail of an ambulance siren pierced the quiet countryside. Dust swirled in the wind, carrying the scent of milk and iron. As paramedics arrived and carefully lifted Tu Tien onto a stretcher, Jack followed closely, refusing to let go of her hand. His mind raced with one thought. This wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. The car disappeared into the distance. The road fell silent again, the only evidence of what happened being a few shattered glass shards and the white stain of spilled milk drying in the sun. And somewhere far away, in that same dim bar, Huang lifted her drink and smiled faintly, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. "It's done," she murmured. But in the quiet that followed, a strange chill ran through her, a whisper she couldn't name, a feeling that fate had just taken note of her sin and was waiting for its turn to strike back. The hospital hallway was cold, washed in the sterile white of fluorescent lights. The echo of hurried footsteps, the beeping of machines, and the low murmur of nurses filled the air, sounds that all blended into a single note of dread. Jack sat slumped in a metal chair outside the emergency room, his hands clasped together so tightly that the veins on his arms stood out. His mind was blank, yet loud. Every second stretched into eternity. The red light above the door flickered, the only thing that moved in his frozen world. He could still see it when he closed his eyes. Tu Tien lying in the road, her skin pale against the red dirt, the milk from the shattered bottles pooling around her like a silent halo. He remembered the way her hand fell limp in his, and the sheer terror that came with thinking he'd lost her. A nurse rushed by, murmuring into a phone, followed by a doctor barking instructions. Jack barely heard the words, only fragments. Leg fracture, heavy bruising, internal bleeding controlled. He stood abruptly as the door swung open and a doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask. The man's eyes were tired, but calm. "She's stable," he said. "It was close, but we managed to stop the bleeding. Her left leg is fractured in 2 places, and she's sustained several contusions. She's resting now. You can see her soon." Jack's breath caught, his knees nearly giving way. "So she's going to be okay?" The doctor nodded gently. "Yes, but she'll need time, and someone to take care of her." Jack swallowed hard, the relief so intense it almost hurt. "I'll stay," he said instantly. "I'll stay with her." The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else. Fear, perhaps. Tu Tien lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, her leg wrapped in thick bandages and elevated slightly. A faint bruise marked her forehead, and the IV line ran delicately into her arm. Jack stepped inside as if afraid to disturb her. For a moment, he just stood by the door, staring. She looked fragile, smaller somehow, nothing like the strong, determined woman who had faced storms and hardships by his side. He walked slowly to her bedside, each step heavy with guilt. Pulling the chair closer, he sat down and reached for her hand. It was cold. He pressed it against his heart. "You once told me," he whispered, voice trembling, "that kindness can change everything. You were right. You changed me." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I should have been there. I should have protected you." The words fell like confessions. He leaned forward, resting his forehead on her hand. "You can rest now, okay? I'll be right here when you wake up." Outside the window, dawn was breaking, faint streaks of pink and gold brushing across the night sky. The world kept moving, but inside that room, time seemed to stop. Meanwhile, in a dim apartment across town, Huang stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. The world looked beautiful from up here, quiet, almost peaceful. But inside her chest, a different storm raged. Hai lounged on the sofa, one arm draped over the back, a cigarette dangling between his fingers. "It's done," he said casually, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Just like you wanted. She's not dead, but she'll wish she were. Broken leg, maybe more." Huang turned slowly, her reflection shimmering faintly in the glass. "Are you sure she's alive?" "She was breathing when I left," Hai replied with a smirk. "But the hit was clean. You could see the look on her face before she hit the ground, like she finally realized she was in the wrong story." Huang frowned, her jaw tightening. "Good. Maybe now she'll understand what happens when she takes what isn't hers." He chuckled. "You talk like Jack's a prize. Maybe you should ask yourself if he's even worth all this trouble." Huang's gaze snapped to him. "He is," she hissed. "You don't know him like I do." Hai raised his hands mockingly. Relax, I'm just saying, you got what you wanted. The girl's out of the picture for now, so why don't you smile? But she didn't. Instead, she crossed the room slowly, her heels tapping against the tile. She picked up his half-empty glass from the table and stared into it, her reflection warped by the amber liquid. Because it's not enough, she said softly. He frowned. Not enough? Huang set the glass down and looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp, feverish. As long as she's breathing, he'll still care. He'll still run to her. He'll still think of her before me. Hai's smirk faded. You're playing with fire. Then let it burn, she whispered. I've already lost everything. My job, my dignity, the man I love. What else is there left to lose? For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, distant but approaching. Hai sighed, flicking ash into the tray. You scare me sometimes, Huang. Good, she said, turning back toward the window. Maybe you should be. Back at the hospital, Jack hadn't moved for hours. The nurses came and went, adjusting the IV lines, checking Tu Tien's vitals. They offered him water, food. He refused it all. He just sat there, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. When the nurse dimmed the lights for the night, Jack finally stood and stretched, his body aching. He walked toward the window and stared at the quiet city beyond the glass. The storm clouds were rolling in from the distance. She's strong, he whispered to himself. She survived worse. But even as he said it, fear clawed at his chest. Whoever had done this, it wasn't random. Someone had wanted to hurt her, to hurt them. He clenched his fists, a low anger simmering beneath his grief. I'll find out who did this, he murmured. And when I do... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The promise in his tone was enough. Hours later, when the rain began to fall outside, a faint sound came from the bed. A small movement, the slightest twitch of fingers. Jack turned instantly. Tu Tien? Her eyelids fluttered, a soft groan escaping her lips. She didn't open her eyes, but her hand tightened weakly around his. Jack's heart nearly stopped. He leaned closer, tears welling again. I'm here, he whispered. You're safe now. You're safe. Her lips moved, barely forming words. Jack. He pressed his forehead to hers, relief flooding him. That's right. I'm here. The moment was fragile, a flicker of light in a long night, but it was enough. Jack stayed by her side as the storm outside grew heavier, the sound of rain tapping against the window like an old memory returning. In her apartment, Huang stood in front of her mirror, running a hand through her hair. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, but the reflection that smiled back didn't look like her anymore. It looked colder, sharper. She poured herself another drink and whispered, "It's finally over." But even as the words left her lips, a hollow echo answered inside her, a quiet voice asking if she truly believed that. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating her face for a brief, ghostly second. The smile faded, because deep down, she knew the truth. Things like this never end cleanly. At the hospital, Jack looked down at Tu Tien and tightened his grip on her hand. The rain outside softened into a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, constant and alive. He exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Whoever did this," he whispered, "they'll regret ever touching you." But somewhere far away, a different voice whispered in the dark, the sound of Huang's soft laughter, dripping with satisfaction and denial. And as fate quietly turned its next page, A question lingered in the air like thunder waiting to break. When the storm returns, will love be enough to protect them? Or will it destroy them both?